Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Instant Take. This is not from your usual host, John Negroni, but rather from me, Will Ashton, your regular co-host. So last night, I saw a little Oscar potential favorite. It's the upcoming Bob Dylan biopic from director James Mangold called A Complete Unknown. This is the latest starring vehicle from Timothée Chalamet, but it also has Edward Norton, Elle Fanning, Boyd Holbrook, and a few other notable names attached to it. Now, I believe the embargo for this is December 10th, so even though I'm recording this, I believe like a little over a week in advance, because I saw the movie last night, it might be a little bit until you see it, so maybe my thoughts will sort of, mold or, evolve or devolve or however these things tend to happen as time goes on. And I'll be curious to see where John lands on it, because I don't know if he's planning to see it. And I don't really know if he's even a big Bob Dylan guy. I don't think we've either talked about Bob Dylan or really expressed all that much conversation about folk music, particularly in the 60s. But I'm a fan. I was just looking at my Apple Replay, and it turns out that Bob Dylan was my top artist for the year. I don't think it's consequential that it's related to this film. I know there was a lot of build up to it. I also saw Bob Dylan perform earlier this year. He was with John Mellencamp and Willie Nelson. Yeah, I mean, he is an undeniable folk hero of our time. And I think that's kind of where I've had some reservations about this film going into it, because the thing about Bob Dylan is that he is such an enigmatic, kind of intentionally elusive artist who has taken great strides to muddle the waters, as it were, of his story and legacy, and to do the sort of traditional, rags to riches music biopic with him, even one that's condensed as this one is to his early career in the early to mid 60s, is maybe a little counterintuitive to what Bob Dylan is all about. I think there is a desire to sort of explore that period in depth, because that is a very pivotal point, not only for music and culture at the time, but for Bob Dylan. The movie is based on a book. I believe it's called When Dylan Went Electric. It came out in 2015, and it seems to explore that sort of shift between Bob Dylan and his more acoustic-based folk upbringing in his early 20s to when he became, a more traditional rock artist. And that led up to the release of what many consider to be his best, or at the very least one of his most famous albums, which is Highway 61 Revisited. And so I think there is, I think there's a lot to be explored with him as an artist. I think there's a lot that's been said and should be said about Bob Dylan as a artist and performer. But the thing about that is that we've already gotten, not only a ton of books and a ton of literature and a ton of podcasts and articles about Bob Dylan, but we have from him himself a film that I still need to see and I want to try to watch before we talk about on the show, if we do get around to talking about, which is a music biopic of sorts. I think it's kind of more fictitious than not, but it's called Masked Anonymous, that he co-wrote and is in. And even though that's not a traditional music biopic, I think there is a desire there to be true to like what he perceives himself to be as an artist. There's also the Martin Scorsese documentary, No Direction Home. And I think even more than that, there is the Todd Haynes movie that I really enjoy called I'm Not There, which I think really works because it acknowledges the sort of different, what Taylor Swift would refer to as eras of Bob Dylan's career. The sort of different personas, the different genres, the different time periods. It has all these different artists, different styles that flows into and explores, that I think sort of encapsulates, at least in the 2.5 hour, bottled format, who Bob Dylan is and was as a performer. But as far as this movie goes, just looking at it as it is, because I know that music biopics are kind of becoming trendy once again. I think they have been trendy once again since the release and the commercial success, as well as the award success of Bohemian Rhapsody, and I believe that was 2018. There have been quite a few music biopics that have come forward. There is this kind of desire to not only explore, our late great performers, but a lot of them who are still around. I mean, in addition to this movie, we have the Bruce Springsteen movie that I believe Scott Cooper is directing, that Jeremy Allen White is going to be in, And I think sort of similar to this one, I believe that one's more exclusively looking at a pivotal point in his career, which would be the recording of Nebraska, which I consider his best album. And I believe Bruce Springsteen considers that to be his best album as well. But that's neither here nor there. As far as A Complete Unknown goes, this is the return to the genre from Mangold because, he's a director who has done, all sort of different movies at this point. His most recent one was the last Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. He did Logan, obviously, not too long before that, as well as Ford versus Ferrari. But one of his most famous, or at least one of his most, well-seen films is Walk the Line, which was a pretty notable addition to this genre, talking about Johnny Cash, who is in this film, or at least the character of Johnny Cash, I'd say. Obviously, Johnny Cash is no longer with us, unfortunately, but yeah, I mean, I think that is a film that, I think sort of defines this genre in a fairly pat but enjoyable way. But I think its legacy has been understandably and not unwarrantedly, sort of taken down a few pegs by Walk Hard, which is the, Judd Apatow produced a parody of the music genre, the music biopic genre, I should say, that, kind of took that movie to task for how it kind of fits into the sort of cookie cutter format and, kind of plays with these sort of larger than life personas that they, sort of do with these famous musical figures. As far as this one goes, I was curious, as far as Mangold goes, if he was going to, I don't want to say learn his lesson, but, kind of evolve, because that was like 20 or so years ago. It's hard to think about, but it's been a little while since he's done that movie, and I think he has grown and evolved as an artist. And I was curious if he was going to kind of, change or maybe reapproach how he tackles a story such as this one, especially with an artist who's not as easy to find like Bob Dylan. Not that Johnny Cash is an easy to find person, but I think a little bit more kind of, I don't want to say safe. I think a little bit more traditional, I guess, in the sense of like, he is someone who's kind of come from these humble roots that are pretty well known, well defined. He's not as someone, even though he does kind of cut a large figure, I think he's not someone who was as willing to sort of muddy the waters, as I said before, with his legacy. But as far as this movie goes, I think where I stand on it is that I didn't quite understand going into it the necessity for it. Like I said, there's the sort of desire to, explore such a pivotal figure like Bob Dylan, but I just don't know if it was going to not only be true to who he is as an artist, but really explore it with any sort of depth or insight. And I think as far as that goes, I think it's fine. It was a little better than I thought it was going to be, I'll admit, because I think it doesn't try to be so definitive as far as the legacy, I think, of Bob Dylan. I think it kind of puts him as a core figure of this sort of changing and evolving movement. And that's done in part by kind of balancing his story out with Pete Seeger, who is obviously a pretty notable folk musician that's played by Edward Norton in the film. And I think maybe where this movie would have been, I think, a little bit more clean cut or defined is if we had Pete kind of be the main figure and Bob Dylan be a supporting figure. Like, I think the movie would have to be about Bob Dylan. Like, I don't think a studio would fund, unfortunately, a film about Pete Seeger, at least not in 2024. But I think having Bob Dylan be the central figure kind of plays to the movie's disadvantage, because having him be the core figure, as like it said, is kind of counterintuitive, because it is sort of looking at like how Bob Dylan became, not only the person and the artist, but the figure and folk hero that he is. But the big thing that the movie does, without getting too far into the weeds of it, is basically see him as a little bit more humble, but like eager to prove himself, a hungry artist, as it were. And as we follow him into 1965, he becomes a little bit more arrogant, a little bit more aloof, a little bit more stuck in his ways. And as a result, obviously a less sympathetic figure, which I actually kind of respect the movie for. Like, I was afraid going into it, especially with the earlier scenes in the film, that it was going to be a little too clean cut and a little too charitable as Bob Dylan it goes. Even though I'm a fan of his, I don't think we should recognize Bob Dylan as someone who is a saint. He is someone who has had a lot of troubles, a lot of, personal turmoil, and that is explored, I think, fairly well with his relationship with Joan Baez. Baez? I never really know how to pronounce that. Yeah, but I mean, that's a pretty famously or maybe infamously turbulent back and forth on and off relationship in Bob Dylan's life and career. And I think some of the best scenes and the best moments of the film center around that kind of hot and cold relationship. And I'll have to look up that actress's name because I actually thought she did a nice job, and I'm not as familiar with her work. But as I'm doing that, I will. Oh, Monica Barbaro. Barbaro? Barbaro. I apologize. That's not actually quite right. But in any case, I thought she did a nice job. I should also note that all the singing actors in the film, in that case being Timothée Chalamet, Edward Norton, Monica Barbaro, and Boyd Holbrook, who plays Johnny Cash, are all credited for their own vocals in the film. And I think, I think that works. I think there's a desire here to, not make it be so lip singy and artificial. I think, having it be centered around these kind of more grounded, rugged performers, there's a necessity to kind of make that apparent and kind of see them come alive in that respect. But to get back to what I was talking about before, I think as far as the portrayal of Bob Dylan goes, I think as far as Chalamet's performance, I think it works better, or he's more comfortable with the later period portrayal of Bob Dylan. Like, there are moments earlier on where I felt like, okay, I'm just kind of watching, not a bad performance or anything, but, someone playing a performance of Bob Dylan. But when we get into the second half, maybe it's just the look, maybe it's just the fact that, kind of fuzz and curl his hair, and they give him the sunglasses and the jacket and all that. But, there are several moments, I think, in the second half of this film where I was, not feeling like I'm just watching a performance of Bob Dylan, but rather just like kind of seeing, like young Bob Dylan once more. And I think those are the more effective moments for just capturing Bob Dylan. And I think that's why I think I would have been more interested in having Seeger kind of be the more central figure in that point, because Bob Dylan at that point is not someone who is, not that he needs to be likable, but he is someone who is desiring to kind of push away from the movement and move towards his own countercultural desires as an artist. And I think to have the more emotional heart of the film, I think it would be more sensible, I think, to kind of focus on Seeger. He is this kind of more, as the movie portrays him, earnest, heart on his sleeve type guy, and he is someone who just really cares about folk music and the power and the movement of folk music. And I think having Dylan be more of a supporting character would not only give the movie more of a structural focus, but also I think it would, kind of make the legacy or the enigma Bob Dylan prevalent a little bit more. And I think having him just be the main character here, while understandable and maybe unavoidable, is something that I think kind of hurts more than helps the main film in that respect. As far as, the portrayal and everything else of the time period and all that goes, I think, the production design looks really nice. I think the movie looks nice in general from a cinematography standpoint. I think where I kind of get a little woozy about the film as far as its portrayal of the time and the music and the figures of it is that it has such a clear reverence for the time, which is understandable. And I think that would be apparent for James Mangold focusing on the time. But there is a sort of like awe and wonder to it that I think really cuts out the intended authenticity of the story and the characters. Like every moment with Bob Dylan, even when he's not the guy and not Bob Dylan, everyone sort of has this reverence and like this awe of him, and they almost treat him like this sort of Christ like figure. And I think that just kind of, I don't know, it just rings a little cheesy. And that also cuts to, some other moments that, I don't know, maybe for people who are less aware and less knowledgeable about Bob Dylan as a performer and star would maybe take less issue with this. But there are several moments where key figures or key moments in Bob Dylan's life are hinted at, and then they kind of focus on them very intently. And it's like, without giving anything away, it's like, well, who's this person? And then sure enough, he becomes this important band member or this important instrument or whatever you want to figure him to be. And I don't know, it just seems like that stuff is where Mangold didn't quite, maybe take the lessons that film like Walk Hard was teaching. It just kind of seems like he's just kind of falling back into the familiar sort of tropes and cliches of of this genre in a way that I feel like we have sort of evolved, and I think that just kind of hurts more than helps the film as well. But I'm kind of getting into a lot of my criticisms early on. I do think I generally just enjoyed the ride. I don't think it's fully shaped, and I don't think it really has the best pacing in the second half, but I enjoyed it more than I didn't. I think I just kind of liked being around for the music and the performances and just kind of being caught in this time and place and cinematic form. It's more of a light recommendation than a full-hearted one, I think, but considering that I was going into this with some early reservations, I think I walked out of it being more on its side than not, and recognizing where it falls short and where it doesn't quite work, but also being aware that the fact that, it's kind of sized up to an almost impossible task. And the fact that I think it works more than it doesn't, I think is an achievement in its own right. I just don't think you're going to quite, in this format at least, make a definitive Bob Dylan movie. Even if that may be or not be the intent of the film, that's neither here nor there. But I don't know. It's a tricky thing to do. I think they do it fine. I think Mangold kind of, proves to be, the acceptable B-grade director that he usually always is. And I don't know if it's going to get any awards consideration beyond maybe the performances and the look of it, but I guess we'll see. I'm very curious to hear what John thinks if he ends up seeing it. But yeah, that's my early thoughts. It's my instant take. Hope you enjoyed it. I apologize for rambling, kind of going on and off. Maybe it's fitting for an evaluation of Bob Dylan and the movie about him. But anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm going to cut it off now. Bye.